Hello, everyone, and welcome to Application Development with ASP.NET. This is episode number 17, part 12, with your host, Mr. Nelson LeKay. Nelson.
Hey.
Hey. Also joining us, Mr. Zach Parrish.
And good evening.
And good evening to you, sir. Nelson, let me just hand it on over to you so you can explain what we shall be doing tonight.
All right. Well, the next step is to get our authentication working, which is going to involve getting a user domain model set up properly and working with the database. And it's going to involve getting some controllers and finally some real routes going with our authentication for logging in and logging out.
Sweet.
It's also going to involve the creation of a user in the case that no users have previously been created, which will be using our console application for this.
Awesome.
So yeah, basically what I'm saying is this is going to last a few videos, but we're going to cover a lot of stuff, and hopefully by the end of it we'll have you'll have a better idea about where this application is going as far as the architecture.
Sweet.
Now that we'll finally see it in use. First thing is I'm going to go ahead and nuke all this code out of here.
Not just this, but everything. Delete new project.
Delete all the classes and everything we've built so far. Throw out a random disclaimer that things do change, and that starts with all of our code, which we're now going to ashcan.
Well, I mean, you do bring up a good point. Things do change, and they will change, and yeah. But for right now, we're sticking with what we have so far. So yeah, the first step with the authentication, it really does kind of start in the controller for your logging in, logging out. But we're going to start actually writing the service for it, which will go inside of the domain, because it will be a domain concern. We're going to be building the concept of authentication into all of the code that's responsible for, well, running our domain.
So the service is going to go into the domain and not into the services area?
Well, it's going to be a domain service.
Oh, okay. Just making sure I understand, because, you know.
There's so many pieces of the terminology I've thrown out that may be confused, like domain service versus just what you would call a service. And then,
well, only when you have an area labeled domain and another area labeled service, and you're going to make another service, but it's going to go in the domain. Yeah, maybe.
Because it's a domain service.
Because it's domain service, that's right.
Because you have multiple things. You have like domain services and normal what you would call a service. You have repositories and domain repositories. You have your domain model and your view model and your persistence model.
But I don't see any of those listed. I mean, I was just making a point about what I saw.
I'm just saying that there's lots and lots of ambiguous language.
Okay.
And
that's
so
fair. That's fair.
We'll try to distinguish the two as they come up. Essentially, what
I was just clarifying, man. It's all good. Just keep right on rolling.
Okay. So yeah, actually we are going to go and nuke a lot of code because we have a bunch of stuff over here that we no longer need.
What's it do now that you're getting rid of? Just so I know.
Just adding in the random Nelsons. And
oh, yeah.
The ever so famous bleh address.
Gotcha. Okay.
Getting rid of all of that. We're also going to be getting rid of our route because we're going to be having a discussion about routes here in a video or two, and we'll get that set up properly later. That was just there for testing.
Yeah,
so
you're getting rid of your testing code. That makes sense.
You remember that this is in the application that the global.a6 application derives from.
Yes.
So we delete that route out. And then we're also going to go into our query model, delete our users folder, as well as our users and value objects out of the domain model.
So much stuff has been deleted.
Not really.
Dude, I saw that warning window pop up at least twice. I'm just saying.
Anyway, so yeah.
Shut up, Zach.
Yeah, that's what I heard too.
We're going to start by modeling the logic of the authentication service, and that's actually going to bring up a problem right off the bat that we're going to need to. That's the wrong project. That we're going to need to address. So I'm going to create a new folder or new namespace in the domain. I'm going to call one model. I'm going to call the other services. And the difference between the services in this namespace and the services in that namespace is that these are domain services. These are services that orchestrate the domain model. You don't directly interact with the domain model. Generally speaking, what you do is you ask a service to do something. That service has the knowledge of what the domain model needs.
But it's a domain service, not just a regular service.
Right. The domain service has the knowledge of what the domain or what models need to be instantiated and what the other models, those models need. So they do things like orchestrate the communication between the two. They kind of instantiate the objects that are required to perform an operation. Then they tell the model to go out and do the operation.
Sure.
these services are just generic services. It's in this context, it's just the really generic. I have my repository abstractions, and I have my other things that.
Right. Those are just services.
Stuff and things.
Yes.
Yeah, it's really a generic term to describe a class that performs operations on things.
That's cool.
Okay, so we're going to start with our authentication service, and he's going to be a class. And I'm first really just going to sketch out what exactly this class is going to do. He's going to have a public bool is logged in.
For like 2 seconds when you said you were going to sketch out what the class does, I thought we were about to see some comments. But no.
I figure this is more effective.
It probably is. I was just,
If you want me to turn these into comments.
No, it's all good. It's all good.
No, it's all good. Keep going.
Keep on rolling, man. I was just saying, I got excited.
Email address is a value object that has yet to be created, by the way.
All right.
I'm just going to leave that. So here's the sketch of our authentication service, and here's basically all that he's going to do for now. He's going to log in, which is going to set the isLoggedIn and the logged user properties. And then if those are set, that means the user is logged in. And then depending on which user is logged in, you'll have their GUID right there.
Okay.
To reference them in the database. And then log out will just clear that stuff. Now we immediately have three problems. We need to define our email address, we need to define our user domain model, and then we also need to figure out a way to store if a user is logged in and their logged in user ID inside of the session. Now, if you're not familiar with a session is basically a dictionary that's held on the server side that's uniquely created for every different user that goes in the system for the duration of their visit. So the first time they visit the site, they'll get a session. And then that session is persisted by sending a cookie off to the browser that uniquely identifies the session. And then when ASP.NET inside your server-side code asks for a value stored in the user session, he'll go out, he'll find the cookie that the user has on his browser for the ID, and then if it exists, he'll go out and find the session stored on the server. And that it's important to know that particular detail, because sessions, we can safely store things like the currently logged in user as a GUID, or if they're logged in as a Boolean, because if these were just cookies, the user can edit them. If they're sessions, the user cannot edit them. Another important fact of sessions is that they're cleared when the application restarts, which is a really obnoxious thing that we'll find ways around later.
Okay.
So is this the second or the third issue? I think it's the third issue.
That was the third one. Yeah.
We need a user domain model. So yeah, I'm going to start out creating the value objects namespace, and I'm going to create an email address class, and he's going to have a public static email, or I'm going to call this value to stay consistent between some of the other value objects we're going to be defining. And now we can import this. And you'll notice that I do use, again, we've had this discussion before, I use value objects a lot. And as we get further in this application, you'll see the value of this, especially when it comes to writing HTML helpers that can be identified based off the overload that you're calling and so on. Just, if you're not convinced yet, just wait and see.
Fair enough.
Next, I'm going to create the user's aggregate. And inside of it, I'm going to define a user root. And he's going to have a public virtual GUID ID with a private set. He's going to have a public virtual email address. Just to stay consistent, I'm going to say email address. And then he's going to have a password. And the password is going to be another value object called a hashed password, which will have a public string password hash and a public string password salt. And we'll talk about hashing and salting later once we get to persisting the users and looking them back up. All right, so here is our what am I doing?
Not sure.
It's not virtual, it's private. Ignore me.
You got it.
Okay, so here is our user aggregate root object thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all good. And so when we log in, we're going to be querying against this user object stored in the database using in Hibernate. We're first going to match by the email address, and then we're going to find if this password hashed turns into this, or hashed and salted turns into this hash. And again, it'll probably be a different video when we explain what's going on there, but I just kind of want to get some pseudocode going so that we have context for the next part that we have to implement, which is going to be the session storage. So we'll need our iEntity, what do I call these guys?
The iEntity unit of work, factory, and
provider.
Or provider, yeah.
And if you remember, these are the guys that abstract and hibernate away from us. And I don't know why you guys didn't call that out, but both of these should be public. And we'll start out by starting a transaction. And then inside the transaction, the first thing we're going to do is say user equals trans query over user. Let's import that. So that brings in the using Honeycomb domain model users. And then we're going to say single or default. This is going to bring system.link in from the top. And then user email address value equals email address value. And then we're going to say if user is not null, or how about if user is null, return. Actually, why don't we just do this? Because all we really need at this point is to return out the user out of the transaction. And then ReSharper is telling me that I could break this out into a single line, but I'm not going to just because it would go out to past here. So yeah, so we're going to say if user is not null, or if user is null, go ahead and throw a new exception. We're going to write our own exception class here in a second to better define this. Again, this is more or less this is pseudocode, or sort of pseudocode, real pseudocode or something.
Quasi pseudocode.
I don't know what I'm saying.
There you go.
I'm trying to get to a certain point where I could explain something.
Yeah. No, I understand. Go ahead.
The only thing that's going to change so far is we're going to write a better exception class for that. So if the user is null, throw an exception. If he's not null, at this point we need to make sure that his hash password works. The password passed in works against this hash password. To do that, we need to do a little bit more code, which we'll bring in a little bit later. At this point, I'm just going to say if the does not match, then throw. Now let's assume that if we've gotten to this point, the user can be stored in the session. So yeah, the issue is that we need to now store the user ID in the logged user property. Now, how can we go about doing this? This service is going to be injected with AutoFac probably at the application scope, meaning he's going to be a singleton. So that means that every single time any request comes in and asks if the authentication service, if they're logged in, they always get the same instance. So I can't go ahead and say logged user equals user.id because that will log in the user for every request. I need to somehow tap into the session of or sessions of ASP.NET in order to get, or in order to store the values properly. And so that brings in a solution that I came up with, but first I kind of want to show how I would go about doing that without this. And the only real way to do that is to use the HTTP context, which isn't going to be in this project because we don't have a reference to System.Web. And we don't have a reference to System.Web because we want this code to work both in the console and in the ASP.NET version. So that already kind of makes this solution moot, but I'll go ahead and show it how we would go about this anyway. We would just do HTTP session or HTTP context.session or current.session. and then we would say some sort of key like user ID, and then we would say equals user.id. And even if we could access the HTTP context, which we can't, it would still be kind of nasty to rely on this implementation directly, just as it's kind of nasty to rely on and hibernate directly in our code, which is why we abstracted it out. So what we can do is we can do just like we did with Hibernate. We can define an interface called iSession service that gives us the functionality that we need in our domain model to work. But because we're going to be writing against a service, we can swap out the implementation depending on if we're in the console or in the web app, and we'll do that with AutoFac. Now that's generally one of the best ways to do this, but there is a lot more elegant way that will make it to where collisions are impossible, but it'll also make it so our code isn't littered with, if session contains this key, then set this key to this value, otherwise delete this key, and so on. We want to minimize the amount of code that we'll need to work with. And so to do that, I'm going to introduce something that's going to be a little crazy, but we're going to go ahead and do it anyway because it's cool.
Okay.
Basically, what we want our code to do is we want to have something like this. We want to have a private read-only iScoped value of type, and let's say GUID, and we'll call this logged user value, and we'll assign him to session scope.create, and then we'll pass in a lambda user value pointing to that field. And what this code is going to ultimately do once we've written the code required to get it to work is it's going to go ahead and create this private little variable that's going to wrap the logic we would normally have to duplicate 1,000,000 times to properly deal with session values, request values, and application values. So we're going to be defining 3 different scopes. And I know the terminology of scope kind of comes from my work with Cold Fusion, but I think it translates really nicely where different variables have a different sort of owner, and certain variables are owned in the session, certain variables are owned by cookies, certain variables are owned only during the context and the duration of a request, and certain variables are just owned by the entire application, analogous to a public static member. So basically for the rest of the video we're going to be getting this code working, more or less. So to do that, the first thing is we have to have our iScoped value. And the reason why I'm doing an iScoped value rather than, like, for example, an iSession value is I want to be able to share as much code as I can between the different scopes that we're going to be implementing. Right now we're going to only be working on sessions, but eventually we're going to need cookies as well, which will be handled much the same way. The iScope value is simply going to be an interface that, like I said, it wraps a value that could be potentially stored anywhere. And also this doesn't have to be, but I'm going to prefer to have it static. By the way, that's just a little thing. So first of all, I'm going to create a interface. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and write a new namespace called abstract, and then I'm going to put because it's not really an abstract service. It's more like an abstract, well, it's more like an abstract interface. iScoped value, and he's going to have some he's going to be generic obviously, and he's going to have some basic members for determining if he exists within his owning scope, and he's going to have methods for removing himself from the current scope, and methods for getting the current value and setting the current value of this value in the current scope, or whatever scope he's attached to. So we're going to have tGetValue. We're going to have void setValue tValue. We're going to have void remove, and we're going to have a property defined up here called hasValue. And he's not going to have a setter. So basically, just this interface, and I'm going to actually go ahead and write the code in an authentication service against this interface, minus the actual code to get it to work, which will be the session scope. So let me bring in that interface by importing in honeycomb-based abstract, and now we have our logged user value. And what we're going to do is we're going to wrap these 2 properties with it. So logged user is going to be get, it's going to be return logged user value dot has value, logged user value dot get value. I'm actually going to turn that into a property as well. Sorry about that. Yeah, I could actually just turn the setter into a value. I generally abstain as much as I can from properties, but then I just realized that properties were the most appropriate thing for that situation. So we're going to have value, otherwise return null, and we're going to have to do a little cast here to get this ternary to work. Ignore this little implementation detail. The reason you have to do this, by the way, is that the ternaries require that both these the value of this expression and the value of this expression are the exact same type. The value of this expression, unfortunately, is a GUID. The value of this expression is null. Unfortunately, GUIDs are value types and cannot be turned into null. So I'm going to have to go ahead and cast it to a nullable GUID, and then, yeah, stuff and things. And then our setter is basically just going to wrap around that. Logged user value, and he's going to be a private setter because we don't want anybody else logging in other than going through our login method. And if I could spell, logged user value dot value equals value, and of course we get a right. I'm stupid. Actually, I'm going to have to write a little bit of logic here. I just realized my mistake. I have to say if the passed-in value is null, then logged user value dot remove, otherwise logged user value. I forgot that we're working with a that's a lot of values. I forgot that we're working with a nullable GUID for a second. Is logged in is actually going to simply be a getter, and he's going to return logged user does not equal null. So I hope that's pretty straightforward. If there's no user currently logged or no user ID set in the logged user value, then just return false. Then to use this code, all we have to do is logged user, or actually all we have to do at this point is just logged user because we were the setter for him, and just do user.id. And so I know you guys don't have like the context to appreciate this because you haven't done much ASP.NET development.
Right.
But this does abstract a lot of the nastiness that you have to deal with if you are using the HTTP context directly.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
In addition, with the information passed into here, we're going to be able to construct a guaranteed to be unique key to store this in the session scope. Because if you remember, the session scope is a key object pair, or a string object key value pair. Okay, so at this point, we just need to implement session scope. And this is kind of a problem, actually. The issue is that we can't access a static member or a static method like this because that static method will have to be defined in a layer above this layer. And unfortunately, session scope is obviously something that's implemented by ASP.NET directly. So to do that, we have a few different options, actually. Probably the best option would be to write the abstraction, or the less optimal abstraction, where we just have a service called iSessionService, and then have the session scope depend on that. The issue is, I know I'm not making much sense here, so sorry. Basically, the problem is the session scope is always going to have to depend on code that is going to have to reside below this layer that he's defined. And because we're not getting him through a artifact, there's no way to switch out the implementation at runtime. Now, we could do something nasty or we couldn't even do that because we're not in a web project, so we have no reference to the dependency injection or the dependency resolver. So basically what I'm trying to say is that the solution for this particular problem is incredibly nasty, and once we write it, we'll just forget about it and use its very clean interface from there on out and just completely forget about how we made it possible. So yeah, that was basically a long-winded apology for anybody who might be looking at my code.
Okay.
I think you're all right, man.
Okay, so I'm actually going to be writing this is session scope. I'm going to stick in the services folder or namespace. The problem is I just did services.abstract, which means that I'm going to have to delete that, create an abstract folder, and dump all these guys in there. And nothing else changes about the code. They're just physically in a different folder. And I'm going to write a session scope. And it's going to be a public static class. And the only thing he needs, at least public facing, is going to be a public static I value or I scoped value of type T, or what I call it. I'm pretty sure I called it create. Yeah, create of type T. Actually, yeah, that's required. Ignore me. And then he's going to take in, this is where it starts to get weird, an expression of type func of typed I scoped value of type T. That's actually not the worst part about this class. But, I mean, do I need to... I mean, Jason, are you...
No, I don't. Yeah, I don't think any. I mean, you did cover expressions at least to a basic extent. I don't think this is a problem.
No.
Okay. And then when I go ahead into my client code over in the authentication service, I can bring this in here now by just importing the honeycomb-based services namespace.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, this is just creating an expression that only contains a reference to a field, and I can use that to my advantage by taking this expression that was passed in to figure out the fully qualified path to this field and use that to generate a key. And the benefit of doing it this way rather than a string is that it's now type safe. Meaning, now if my field name changes, I have to change this code for it to work properly, so all the keys will stay in sync. Actually, earlier drafts of this particular code, I used a stack trace, environment.stacktrace, to determine what line of code actually executed this line of code.
Okay.
And I was going to seed a random number generator. It was pretty nasty. But yeah, so all he's going to do is he's going to identify the field. So he's going to use this expression to come up with something that looks like this in string format. I didn't copy hard enough. So basically, with this, we're going to get that.
Okay.
And I'll just leave that up there. This implementation isn't actually particularly long, but... Now, the first thing we need to do is our field selector will have a node type. And his node type has to be a particular node type, and it's going to be a member access. So if the expression passed in, because remember, you could pass in an arbitrary expression, just as long as it evaluates to this, you can pass in anything you want. And obviously we want to discourage anybody using the system in any way other than what it was intended. So we're going to have to do some sanity checks here at runtime to determine if they were using the code properly. So if they did not access a member, then throw a new invalid operation exception. Okay, and then at this point we can now cast the field selector into a member access node type. Access. I totally forgot so please forgive me. I'm going to use this to help me figure out member binding member expression. That's it. So we're going to cast into member expression, which corresponds to the member access node type. And of course, it doesn't like that. Oh, right. body. The expressions are the bodies, not the parent. I'm stupid. So now we have to say if member access is not a field, or if member access.member is not a, oh, come on, member info, member node type. That's exactly what I had before. Member type. Such a confusing library to work with. I'm glad I don't have to do it very often. But thank God for code completion. So if it's not a field, then we're actually just going to throw this exact same exception. I'm going to yank this guy out into a constant. Exception. I'm going to bring him down. Oh, come on, resharper. Bring him down there, and then remove these curlies because those are nasty. And then, of course, to be constant, he needs to be a const string. And then I'm essentially just going to throw the exact same thing. This is actually better suited to be in a resource file, but we haven't talked about those yet. Okay, so at this point, we can now, sorry about that, we can now identify this by getting the type of the declaring type of the member and then the member name. So it's going to be the declaring type plus the member name, and this is going to be var key. And then we'll string.format it, and we'll bring in our member access.member dot reflected type dot full name, or sorry, declaring type dot full name, and then comma member access member name. Okay, so we now have our key. But here is another kind of potential sanity check that we might want to do, because if we have multiple scoped values in this class and we forget to change the expression that it points to, there's no way for, the compiler to identify that that's the correct code. So we need to determine at runtime if anybody has previously tried to use the exact same key, in which case we're going to throw. So does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
In that case, we'll do a private hashed set. No, not you. No, not you. You. Hash set of string. You use keys, and then we'll just do a static constructor. Used keys is not static, of course. Alrighty, then we'll do if used keys add key is false, then throw a new invalid operation exception, duplicate key. Okay, so that will prevent anybody from using the same key twice at any time. So at this point, we now have the final, of course, you're going to want to change to a read-only, then you're going to want to change to be uppercased. There you go. Now, the last thing we need to do is actually provide the implementation for our, where is that guy? Our iScoped value. And all he's going to do is delegate off to our session service. So I'm going to go ahead and create a private class inside of this session scope. And he's going to be session scoped value. And he's going to implement iScoped value of type T. And then he's going to implement all these guys. Has value, and again, like I said, this guy's just going to delegate off to our session service or session scope class. But the beautiful thing about this is because this is a private class within our session scope class, we can access private members of the session scope. So first I'm going to bring this back here because we need more room, and then I'm going to start implementing the members that we need. going to return out false for right now. And then we're also going to need a set value and a get value and a remove. So we now have a get value and a set value and a remove. That is going to take a key. And then our session scoped value is going to take in one object in his constructor, which is going to be the key that was generated for him. So private string key, and I'm going to generate a constructor for him. So now he has a constructor that just takes in the key, sets it to his private key, and then again, just like up here, which we haven't done yet, as value key. And ReSharper is going to complain about that, but personally I would leave it. Because basically, at this scope, this is completely valid. It'll go, well, this is completely valid. It'll go and it'll find this method based off of where it's nested, but I personally think that's ugly. So I'm going to explicitly declare that. It's one of the few times where I've defied ReSharper. So our get is going to return out a session scope dot get value of type T, passing in our key. And our set is going to do session scope dot set value T key values. That T will be redundant, so I'm going to go ahead and remove him. And I think I forgot to, yeah, I did. I forgot to specify a T value for a set value. And our remove is going to essentially do the same thing. It's going to be session scope dot remove key. So now everything's being delegated back into our static class. And we didn't have to, because he's a private class, we didn't have to expose any of these methods out into the outside world. So at this point, we can now return our new implementation of our private class, our session scoped value of type T with the specified key. Return new. Okay, so that's pretty much all the nasty stuff we have to implement for this particular class. Actually, no. There's the final nasty thing. But this is all the kind of boilerplate stuff we have to write for this class. We'll be abstracting this out later as we need the cookies, but we don't need cookies for it right now. So I'm going to go ahead and collapse these two methods so we can focus on finishing up our implementation. Now you're going to have to realize that this is in our honeycomb.base project, which means he does not have references to System.Web or System.Web.MVC or AutoFac. He's designed specifically to be to not have any knowledge of any of those particular libraries. The issue with that is that we cannot use any form of dependency injection, nor can we piggyback on the dependency resolver class defined in System.Web MVC, nor could we provide a basic implementation here, nor could we swap out this entire class at runtime without having to expose something public that can be altered about this class depending on the runtime of either the console or the web app. So you see where I'm kind of going from with this? We're basically going to have to write a session scope inside of our web and inside of our console and set it to some public property on this class for it to be able to properly delegate itself. So there's different ways we can do this. In my mind, I actually envisioned doing public functions, but then I realized that an interface would actually be a lot better. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. We're going to have our I session scope service class, which is not static because interfaces can't be static because that makes no sense. And then he's going to essentially have all of these members, more or less, without implementations, obviously, because he's an interface. And then we're just going to delegate off into this class, and he's going to be more or less following the ugly, stupid, horrible singleton pattern, where we have a private static iSessionScope service scope service, and we're going to have a public static set void set scope service session scope service if scope service is null, then go ahead and throw out. Or if it's not null, sorry. Because we don't want anybody setting the session service after it has already been set and potentially has already had items created in his, or scoped items created for him, because otherwise we'll get some weird undefined behavior. And then essentially what I'm going to do is these actually now become redundant. And I apologize for that. But basically what I'm going to be doing is inside of here, I'm just going to say scope service. It's actually going to be session scope.scopeService.getValue. So basically now deferring to this particular interface that we can replace at runtime without any need for any sort of dependency injection that we can't actually access from this location. So now I'm going to go ahead and remove ReSharper's telling me that these are no longer used. Remove those, and at this point, once this is renamed, which I don't know why ReSharper will have a private static member be uppercase if it's read-only and lowercase otherwise. That doesn't make much sense to me, but I don't know. So yeah, this is pretty much the code that we need for this. This could be read-only. For this service. And finally, the last thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to be breaking this out into its own file. iSession scope service. And so I basically just yanked it from here out into here and put it in abstract. And then I'm going to hit Control-Shift-R, and adjust the namespaces for it so it becomes base services abstract. So now we have our sort of, I don't know what to call this, abstract singleton class where we can replace the guts of this by setting some sort of singleton class at runtime. And that is the ugliness that I was kind of referring to. The reason why this is particularly ugly is that we now have a potential for bugs, or well, not bugs. We now have a potential to get ourselves in a situation where we try to reference this while it's null. And the only situation where that's going to happen is a situation that you should never, ever find yourself in the first place. And if you're doing that, you should probably not. But if you ever have a static object initializer that is either the HTTP application class or any of its parents, and they try to set themselves to the session scope before the application initialization is run, that will cause an exception to be thrown. But again, that's a case of you shouldn't be doing it that way in the first place. That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now I'm going to close all of these files, and I'm going to go into our .web folder, or our .web project. If you remember, our .web is the web-specific implementation of all of our stuff. And I'm going to write a session scope service, and he's going to be session scope, and he's going to make session scope not sealed. Are you sealed? Oh, he's static. What am I doing? It's the iSession scope service. Okay, so now we just have to implement this session code in the context of a web application, which is really just using the HTTP context .current .session or contains, or sorry, contains, oh, that's not going to work properly. Ignore me. Key is not null. Not null. And then our get value is going to be HTTP context, current session key, and then we're also going to have to make sure that this, if it's not the type that we want, then throw new invalid operation exception. Just some sanity checking right there in case someone set this to a value that isn't the type that we're expecting, because otherwise this next line would fail. And then of course we're also going to have to say if not get has value key return default T. Our set value is going to be actually really straightforward. HTTP context.current .session key equals value, and our remove is just going to be as straightforward. HTTP context current session dot remove key. Also, I have some weird stuff going on over here. For some reason, I think set value wants to return a value, which obviously is not true. So let me go ahead and fix that. Set value will now return void. And let's make sure that we didn't break anything in our session scope class. And it doesn't look like we did. So yeah. Now basically what we've managed to do at this point is take pretty much every single time that you've ever wanted to access a value out of the session, this is what you've had to do. And all the time that I spent typing out the same code over and over again, I'm just so sick of it. And sure, if you only need the one session value, that's fine. But eventually, it'll wear on you. Mm-hmm. And that is basically what we just solved. With one exception, we haven't done one thing, but I'll just bring it back over to where we can now access this in a single line of code and then just access it like a normal property. And then the final thing we have to do is we actually have to set the implementation of our session scope service to our web-specific implementation, and we're going to do that in our application.cs in our initialization. And I'm going to do it before everything in our application start. Set scope service, new session scope service. I'm actually going to rename session scope service to web session scope service. So now this guy turned into web session scope service. So yeah, we basically made a rather roundabout when you look at the implementation, but very straightforward to use interface into the HTTP context current session. And I hope that you guys had enough I guess you really haven't had enough context of working with this particular class before, but it is obnoxious having to deal with both key conflicts, which the key conflicts are the worst. Like, you think that user-ID is not going to be used anywhere else in your application, you're wrong. So the first problem is key conflicts. The second big problem is definitely having to check every single time you need to access it, if it exists in the item and if it's the right value, and that wears on you.
Okay.
So this was just a really slick interface over that, and I think that's pretty much it for now. The next step here would be to write our hashing code to get the login and the create user and set password code to work, which we don't have yet because we don't have a user service.
Right. Awesome.
So yeah.
Okay. Then if there's nothing else, we can go ahead and wrap this video up.
One last thing.
Okay.
We can implement the logout now.
Oh, nice.
Or log to user value.remove. There.
Very good.
Awesome.
All right. Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. That will wrap up this video.